This is the first of a series of television programs about my life and the times I've lived through. What astonishing times they've been. My life almost exactly covers the span of this century because I was born in the year 1900. Very convenient for working out my age, but this also means that I've lived through all the tremendous changes of the 20th century. Social, political, technological. This has been a troubled century, but it's been exciting too. I really wouldn't have wished to live in any other. This is my home, Broadlands in Hampshire, where I've settled down. But in the making of this series, we're revisiting a number of places which have been important in my life. We're going to Malta, where so much of my naval career was centered. We're going to Burma and Southeast Asia. We're going to India, where I was able to carry out probably the most important single act of my whole life. But the story begins in 1900 and takes us back to an almost forgotten world. The world in which my great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, ruled over the British Empire as Queen Empress to Windsor. My mother was Queen Victoria's granddaughter. Her name was also Victoria. She was born here in Windsor Castle in the great central room of the Lancaster Tower. This is where I was born, Frogmore House in Windsor Great Park, just a few hundred yards from the castle. I was born in the 63rd year of Queen Victoria's reign, on the 25th of June, 1900. I was the youngest of 4 children. My sister Alice, Prince Philip's mother, was already 15 years old. My sister Louise, later to become the Queen of Sweden, was 11, and my brother Georgie, nearly 8. Queen Victoria was always very particular about the names of her descendants. When I was born, she wrote to my mother, very difficult writing, but she was 81, "There's one thing which would give me great pleasure if you and Louis approve of it, viz., if you would add the name Albert to the 4 others." So I was christened Louis Francis Albert Victor Nicholas. But all my life, people have called me Dickie. My great-grandmother drove over in her carriage from the castle to the christening, which took place in this ground floor room in Frogmore House. It was obviously a tremendous thing to be one of Queen Victoria's descendants. A distinguished historian has said they filled, or were about to fill, the thrones of Europe, the imperial thrones of Russia and Germany, the kingdoms of Greece, Romania, Norway, Sweden, and Spain, and a number of the minor thrones inside the German Empire. This meant that from my earliest childhood, I had close personal links with many countries, and these led me later to take a close interest in them. World affairs were very largely family affairs. 6 months after my christening, my great-grandmother died, and the Victorian age departed with her. The Victorian age was the age of empire, and the British were proud to boast that theirs was an empire on which the sun never set. It was founded on sea power, and in 1900, when I was born, British sea power was supreme.
At Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee Review in June 1897, the Royal Navy paraded 165 fighting ships. This was a tremendous spectacle of naval might. Nobody, it seemed, could compete with this. This navy had not been challenged since Trafalgar, 92 years before. Now it was the country's protection, the guardian of trade, the sanction of the empire. Behind the shield of the navy, British democracy seemed secure to advance in whatever direction it pleased, towards further imperialism, or towards socialism, towards materialism, or towards idealism, towards stability, or towards revolution. The strength of the navy permitted Britain these options.
In the year 1900, when I was born, Britain was at war with the Boers in South Africa. There had been humiliating defeats, and British military power was stretched as never before. World opinion was loudly anti-British. Against the threats of other powers, Britain had only one shield, the Navy. Now voices were heard questioning whether the Navy was all it seemed to be. Was it really still supreme? Technology by 1900 had transformed the nature of naval power. In the race between engine power, guns and armor, and underwater weapons, a ship could become obsolete alarmingly quickly. The balance of naval power was changing, so I was born into a period of drastic change, which was bound to affect me very closely. There wasn't much doubt about what I was going to do when I grew up. It was taken for granted I'd go into the Navy. My father was Prince Louis of Battenberg. When I was born, he'd been in the Royal Navy for 32 years. He was a captain, and obviously going to the top. My father belonged to the progressive school of naval officers, the school headed at that time by Admiral Sir John Fisher, who initiated the great naval reforms before the First World War. Fisher called my father out and away the best man inside the Admiralty building. They served together in the Mediterranean, where my father commanded the battleship Implacable until 1902. Of course, it wasn't all family parties like this. There I am on my mother's lap, dressed, as very small boys were in those days, like a little girl. And it was in that same year that my father became the Director of Naval Intelligence, which meant that he was virtually the head of such naval staff as there was in those days. In fact, a disgruntled officer, on leaving the Admiral in 1903, complained that it was practically run by Fisher, Tyrwhitt, and Battenberg. Of course, I was far too young to understand the work my father was doing, but I wasn't too young to appreciate the family naval tradition. In 1905, my brother Georgie entered the Royal Naval College at Osborne, and in 1907, my father went to Malta as second in command of the Mediterranean Fleet, and that I remember well. Malta was fun for a small boy. It was full of sailors, and most sailors seemed to have a way with children. There were no motor cars, but there were carriages and donkey rides, and there were parties. I think it must have been about then I developed a delight in dressing up, which I must admit has never left me. In this photograph, my father and I are wearing costumes given us by my uncle, the Tsar of Russia. My father was dressed as an imperial falconer, and I was a Cossack. My mother took charge of my education. In fact, I didn't go to school until I was 10. This was a positive advantage because she had a flair for teaching. She made it all interesting. She did it absolutely methodically, with timetables for each subject, preparation, and so on. She taught me to enjoy working hard and to be thorough. I was immensely lucky in my parents. My father's interests and talents extended well beyond his profession. He was a fine musician, and he could draw and paint well. My mother was a woman of wide knowledge and culture.
He came really from a most extraordinary family background. His mother, my grandmother, was an extraordinary character, tremendously well informed, and with an ability to argue and to discuss intelligently any subject you care to mention. She was the nearest thing to a perambulating encyclopedia that I think anybody could possibly conceive. At one time, my uncle decided to make a collection and a genealogical table of his relations, which we irreverently call the Almanac de Gagas. He asked, the whole thing started when he asked his mother to tell him about the dates of births and marriages and deaths of some of his relations, and she reeled off pages which he just remembered, and everybody she mentioned, she knew some circumstance about them, some piece of interesting family history, some extraordinary circumstances about their wedding which she'd either been to or knew.
She was outspoken and open-minded, quite devoid of anything like color prejudice or political prejudice. So I was brought up without prejudices too. I was taught to examine everything on its merits. I traveled a good deal as a child, to Malta or Gibraltar with the fleet, or to Germany for holidays at my parents' castle, or to Russia to stay with relations. What with all this and my mother's teaching, by the time my turn came to enter the Navy, I feel I was considerably better equipped than most naval cadets. I owe that entirely to my parents.
At the beginning of the century, the German Empire possessed the most powerful military machine in the world. Backed by vigorous industry and an expanding population, the German army outshone all others in numbers and efficiency. The German emperor, the Kaiser, was the supreme warlord. But the Kaiser was not satisfied with this glittering state. This grandson of Queen Victoria envied her one thing, the supremacy of the Royal Navy. Germany began to build a navy. By 1906, Germany was the world's second naval power. Her fleet was modern, its equipment first class. Gunnery, training, personnel were excellent. The threat was evident. A direct threat not just to the Royal Navy, but to Britain herself. From its bases and harbors in northwest Germany, Emden, Wilhelmshaven, Bremerhaven, Cuxhaven, Kiel, the German fleet faced due west across the North Sea, straight towards Britain. And Britain's bases, after 250 years of naval struggle against Spain and Holland and France, were at Chatham, Portsmouth, Plymouth, facing south. Yet it became more and more obvious every year that the future battleground would be the North Sea. Fortunately, the point was perceived.
It was in 1904, when my father was still Director of Naval Intelligence, that Lord Fisher came back to the Admiralty and occupied this chair in this famous boardroom as First Sea Lord. Already as Second Sea Lord, and then as Commander-in-Chief Portsmouth, Fisher had begun his tremendous work of naval reform. But there's no doubt that his main achievement was during his 5 years here as First Sea Lord. What an extraordinary man Fisher was. My father used to tell me how much he admired Fisher's work and always supported him. But he could never approve of Fisher's methods. He was a man of dynamic energy, full of ideas. He proclaimed that his 3 R's were ruthless, relentless, and remorseless. What upset my father was the intrigue which always surrounded him. Favoritism, Fisher said, is the secret of efficiency. But the effect of his doctrine was to split the Navy from top to bottom. Yet the work he did here at the Admiralty was vital. He prepared the fleet for war against Germany, which he was sure was coming. He started long-range battle practice at last. Gunnery improved out of recognition. Fisher put the Naval Reserve on a sound footing and created the reserve fleet. He scrapped 154 obsolete ships. 50 years later, I got some idea of what that means. And finally, he concentrated the fleet at strategic points, specifically to face the German threat. But the thing that Fisher is most famous for concerns ships themselves. Launching of HMS Dreadnought, the first all-big gun, turbine-driven, fast capital ship. By modern standards, she didn't amount to much. But in 1906, the dreadnought made every other battleship in the world obsolete.
Now, all shipbuilding nations competed on practically level terms. The naval race against Germany gained a fearful momentum. The powers of Europe talked of disarmament, but everywhere arms were multiplying and alignments were being formed. In 1903, King Edward VII visited Paris and prepared the way for friendship between Britain and France, the Entente Cordiale. In 1907, Britain reached agreement with Russia, and now the alignments of Europe hardened into a dangerous pattern. Britain, France and Russia against the triple alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy. The pace of crisis quickened. In 1909, Britain was swept by a scare of secret German construction, which might give Germany naval equality. The Admiralty demanded 6 new dreadnoughts. The economists in the government, headed by Winston Churchill and Lloyd George, insisted that 4 would be ample. The slogan was heard, "We want 8, and we won't wait." The press became strident. The Observer told people to insist on the 8, the whole 8, and nothing but the 8. The 8 were laid down. The scare had been largely based on fear and false information. Churchill wrote later, "But although Lloyd George and I were right in the narrow sense, we were absolutely wrong in relation to the deep tides of destiny." King Edward VII died in May 1910. 9 crowned heads followed the king's hearse, prominent among them the German Kaiser, beside his cousin, the new King George V. The Kaiser's gesture proved to be the last flicker of friendship between Britain and Germany. Scarcely had George V mounted his throne than a frightening gap in defense preparations was revealed. In 1911, the Agadir crisis made war with Germany seem an immediate prospect. The army's plan was to fight beside the French. But now it turned out that the Navy had no war plan at all. Fisher carried plans in his head, and Fisher had retired. Fortunately, the crisis evaporated, but the government was deeply shocked, and important changes followed at the Admiralty.
This is the chair of the First Lord of the Admiralty at the head of the boardroom table. And Winston Churchill first came to it in October 1911 to clear up the mess that had been revealed in the Agadir crisis. My father came back to the Admiralty 2 months later as Second Sea Lord and triggered off many of the new personnel reforms. But Churchill's chief task was to set up at last a real naval staff to prepare strategic plans and to integrate them with the War Office, so that we should never find ourselves in such a ridiculous position again. My father had always believed in a naval staff, and he was Churchill's strongest backer against, I need hardly add, the usual stiff opposition. Winston would sometimes walk home with my father after the day's work, and that's how I first came to know him. He was very good with young people, very friendly. He would talk to one as though one were grown up. He certainly flattered the Dovecots as First Lord. He upset a great many people, but his achievements were great. During his first 18 months, he spent 182 days at sea, something no First Lord had ever done before or since. He improved lower deck conditions, increased the prospects of promotion to commissioned rank, and brought forward younger officers. He speeded up work on the North Sea bases, Rosyth and Cromarty and Scapa Flow. But it takes time and money to build a naval base. Time was all too short. My father became the First Sea Lord in December 1912, and together he and Winston started a naval war staff. That again is a long job. You can't produce a large number of fully trained staff officers overnight. They revised the war plans and decided on the strategy of distant blockade. But without a doubt, the most important thing that Winston and my father did together was their decision not to hold the normal annual maneuvers in 1914. Instead, they decided to have a test mobilization of the reserve fleet to discover just how effective our plans were for bringing the Navy quickly up to strength in time of war. The test mobilization took place in July 1914 and worked without a hitch. I was in the Navy now myself. I'd entered the Royal Naval College at Osborne the year before, and to our intense excitement, we cadets were mobilized too. I was sent to my brother's ship, the battlecruiser New Zealand. After the test, the whole fleet assembled at Spithead for the Royal Review, and I had a grandstand seat. It was a wonderful spectacle, a sort of grand climax of 200 years of British naval supremacy. King George V in the Royal Yacht Victoria and Albert passed in review 40 miles of ships, manned by 70,000 men. There were 59 battleships, 24 of them dreadnoughts. There were 78 destroyers, 16 submarines, and a large number of minor craft. None of us could know that this whole tremendous organization of naval might was going to be put immediately to the test. Because all the time the King was reviewing his fleet at Spithead, the international situation was building up to the final crisis.
Now, across the narrow seas, the alignments of Europe came to their fruition. Austria menaced Serbia. Serbia turned to Russia for support. Austria leaned on Germany. But Germany could only help by attacking France through Belgium. Outside Buckingham Palace on August the 4th, 1914, Britain cheered her entry into war with Germany. For the King and his family, for the Battenbergs, for all the nation, this was a watershed. The Great War had begun. Inside the Admiralty, a heavy burden fell on the First Sea Lord, Prince Louis of Battenberg.
It was on July the 26th, 1914, that he took the most momentous decision of his life. It was a Sunday. The First Lord, the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, in fact, I believe most of the Cabinet, had gone away for the weekend. The next day, the men who'd been called up for the test mobilization were due to be paid off and the fleet dispersed. From a position of unparalleled naval strength and preparedness, the country would pass overnight into a state of unpreparedness. On the other hand, not to demobilize on the advertised date could be construed as an act of war and might make the international situation even worse. It was a fearful decision to have to take, and I remember my father telling me he'd had to take it absolutely alone. He decided not to demobilize. He wrote out the telegrams in his own hand, ordering the fleet to stand fast. 2 days later, a signal went out from the Admiralty. Tomorrow, Wednesday, the First Fleet is to leave Portland for Scapa Flow. Destination is to be kept secret. Winston Churchill wrote, "We may now picture this great fleet with its flotillas and cruisers, steaming slowly out of Portland Harbor, squadron by squadron. Scores of gigantic castles of steel wending their way across the misty, shining sea like giants bowed in anxious thought. We may picture them again as darkness fell. 18 miles of warships running at high speed and in absolute blackness through the narrow straits, bearing with them into the broad waters of the north the safeguard of considerable affairs. The king's ships were at sea. And so, when Britain found herself at war on August the 4th, 1914, my father was able to report to the king, we had the drawn sword in our hand. Many people thought that the war would be over by Christmas, and every day we expected to hear there had been a decisive naval battle. I envied my brother Georgie, who was already in a battle cruiser, and my cousin Bertie, the king's second son, who was in the Grand Fleet.
The Grand Fleet assembled far to the north at Scapa Flow in the Orkneys under Admiral Sir John Jellicoe. Further south at Rosyth stood Vice Admiral Sir David Beatty with the fast battle cruisers. It was widely believed in 1914 that the German fleet would immediately spring out from its bases across the North Sea and offer battle to the British. It did nothing of the kind. The young, proud German Navy, built to challenge England, remained in harbour. As days of inaction passed into weeks, then months, the Royal Navy and the country at large felt cheated. It was hard to understand this style of war. It was hard for laymen to understand that naval supremacy had already been asserted. British trade in all the oceans was able to continue almost without interruption. Food, raw materials, the sinews of war continued to pour into British ports, while the German merchant marine had been swept silently from the seas, thanks to naval supremacy. The British Expeditionary Force was conveyed to France, maintained and steadily increased, without the loss of a single man, horse or gun by enemy action at sea. The Empire was mobilized. Australians and New Zealanders were brought to the Middle East, Canadians to Britain, Indian troops to France. This was naval supremacy at work. But the man in the street took such things for granted. The public wanted action. Recruits flocked to the army by the 100,000. In Whitehall, the recruiting officers worked without a pause. But across the road, there was silence. What was the Navy doing to match the Army's deeds? Was all well at the Admiralty? The public mood was ugly in 1914. All over the country, there were invasion scares and spy panics. Anti-German feeling ran high and turned against Germans and Austrians who lived in Britain. German shops were attacked and looted. Even German churches were stoned.
It was a form of hysteria that gripped people at that time. They insulted German governesses. They wouldn't listen to German music. They'd even kick Dachshunds in the street. They saw spies under every bed. And the press played this hysteria up and made it worse. Public figures were attacked. Lord Haldane, the great war minister who had reformed the army, was accused of being pro-German and hounded out of public life. They attacked my father because of our German name. One paper even carried an attack on my father on one page, and on another page, a glowing report of the first death in action of a member of the royal family. His nephew, Prince Maurice of Battenberg, killed at Ypres, fighting in the 60th, the King's Royal Rifle Corps. My father came to the conclusion that these attacks on him were damaging to the Navy. On October the 29th, he resigned his position as First Sea Lord, and the government, under duress, accepted his resignation.
He finally felt that he couldn't carry on. He couldn't carry his heavy load of responsibility without the support of public confidence. And he tendered his resignation to Winston Churchill, who was then First Lord of the Admiralty. He wrote a most dignified and moving letter. Winston received it with infinite regret. And in his reply, he said, "The Admiralty will bear the imprint of your work. not only now, but even more in the future. Winston then referred the matter to my father, who was Prime Minister at the time. My father was appalled. He felt degraded. He felt that it was a stain on his own honor to accept this resignation. And yet, he and Winston agreed, regretfully, reluctantly, that it was inevitable. Prince Louis behaved throughout with the greatest dignity. He was our beloved personal friend. And the result, of course, of his going was that the nation lost a great public servant.
The news of my father's resignation came as a terrible shock to me. It was probably even worse for my brother. He was with the fleet. I was still at Osborne. I remember having to go away and think about it alone. I didn't want to see the other cadets. I just wanted to be by myself. It was all so stupid. My father had been in the Royal Navy for 46 years. He was completely identified with England, and we always regarded ourselves as an English family. We were well aware of our German connections, of course. How could we not be? We're a very old family, and proud of it. I believe I can trace us back through 44 generations to the 6th century AD. I know I can trace our line back to the 9th century, to Charlemagne, in fact. At that time, our lands were in Brabant and Lorraine, an area which is now mostly in Belgium. The German connection didn't begin until the 13th century, when one of my ancestors became the Landgrave, that is, the ruler of Hesse. Hesse became the family center and remained so. My grandfather was Prince Alexander of Hesse. He was a professional soldier who saw a lot of fighting. He had a distinguished career in the Russian army and became a general. He even had a regiment of Russian lancers named after him. In 1854, when my father was born, my grandfather was a general in the Austrian army. 12 years later, Hesse was at war with Prussia. This was the decisive struggle for the leadership of Germany. A confederation was formed which included Austria, Bavaria, Saxony, and Hesse to oppose the Prussians. My grandfather was called out of retirement to command the principal Confederate Army Corps. But even then, the Prussian army was a most efficient military machine. They had planned this campaign thoroughly, and the whole thing was over in 7 weeks. The Confederation was quite unprepared, and so was beaten. So my father had good reason to detest the Prussians from a very early age. Apart from that, he'd made up his mind he wanted to be a sailor. There was no such thing as a German Navy at that time, so when he was 14 years old, he came over to England, became a naturalized British subject, went to a naval crammer, and joined the Royal Navy in 1868. He then worked his way to the top by sheer ability. Now his career was finished, all because of the ridiculous suspicion that he might be in sympathy with the very people he'd come to England to avoid.
On the day of Prince Louis's resignation, Turkey came into the war on Germany's side and opened up new strategic prospects for British sea power. If Turkey could be knocked out, the Allies would be able to open the Dardanelles Straits and a direct ice-free line of communication with Russia. Western war material could be poured in to sustain the hard-pressed Russian armies. Perhaps even a new joint front against Germany might be established. Glittering prospects, romantic place names, Constantinople, the Golden Horn. To no one did they appeal more forcibly than to Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty. Churchill's mind conceived the Gallipoli expedition.
Gallipoli is one of the large ifs of history. It was the great combined operation of the First World War, and it profoundly affected the British war effort, not just in 1915, but for many years after. In 1915, I was still a naval cadet, though now at Dartmouth. I was tremendously interested in this campaign, and I discussed it with my father, who now at last had more time to spare to answer my questions. My father was a friend of the famous American Admiral Mahan, who'd made a penetrating analysis of the use of sea power. My father had studied this deeply. He questioned the wisdom of a naval power like Britain committing herself to a continental land war. Sea power, he told me, is far more than just winning naval battles. It's a flexible weapon. It enables one to strike where one wishes and get away again if necessary. It can open up new fronts in places difficult for the enemy. It offers opportunities of surprise. All these things, my father believed, were potentially true of Gallipoli. But to his great dismay, all the advantages were thrown away. Early in January, the Allied fleet bombarded the Turkish forts at the entrance of the Dardanelles, and so alerted the enemy. After that, nothing much happened for 2.5 months. The big naval attack was on March the 18th. Things went badly that day. 4 French and 3 British big ships were either sunk or seriously damaged. It then became perfectly clear to everyone that this would have to be a combined operation. The army would have to take a hand. The army was quite unprepared. Troops were sent out in ships from England which were not tactically loaded, so they had to be sent to Alexandria to be reloaded. There were no assault craft, no specialized equipment of any description, no amphibious training. All the rules of combined operation were broken. Well, we all know the result. Severe losses on some of the beaches, the sea stained red with blood for 50 yards out from the shore. Then a long drawn-out costly campaign, ending in failure. It cost Winston Churchill his office of First Lord. It lost British sea power the chance to intervene decisively, because nothing like this was ever tried again. And 25 years later, when Churchill set up a combined operations headquarters, of which I was to become chief, the ghosts of Gallipoli still haunted us.
After Gallipoli, the strength of the British Empire was poured into France. Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians and South Africans gathered on the Western Front. The British Expeditionary Force grew to nearly 1.5 million men. Nothing like this had ever been seen in British history. Hundreds of heavy guns, thousands of field guns, vast quantities of ammunition were assembled. Division upon division of fresh troops underlined the fact that for the first time, Britain was preparing to take the leading role in a major continental war. As though to emphasize this historic tide mark, now at last came the long-awaited contest of the 2 great fleets. The German Navy passed to the offensive. This was the moment for which the German fleet had been constructed. This was the moment the Royal Navy had been waiting for, ever since the Fisher reforms. Beatty's battle cruisers from Rosyth, Jellicoe's Grand Fleet from Scapa Flow steamed out to meet the challenge. The clash came on May the 31st, 1916. 259 British and German warships met and grappled in the North Sea. The Battle of Jutland. Bad visibility and bad communications hampered the British fleet. The issue of a murky day was curiously enigmatic. The British lost 14 ships, the Germans 11. And the Navy failed to destroy the German fleet, as all Britain expected it to do. But the Germans also failed in their intention to cripple the British fleet, and they never sought battle again. For Britain and the Navy, the great shock of Jutland was the sudden blowing up, one after another, of 3 great battle cruisers. Queen Mary, Indefatigable, and invincible, with awful loss of life.
The battle cruiser fleet was commanded by Vice Admiral Sir David Beatty, whose flagship was HMS Lion. I joined the Lion less than 7 weeks after the Battle of Jutland. She was still under repair in Rosyth dockyard. She was in a pretty good mess. There was a gaping hole where the center turret had been, and cordite fires had left their marks all over the place. But the spirit of the ship's company was sky high. I was terribly disappointed to have missed the battle. My brother had been in the thick of it, and of course, everybody was talking about it. But I was tremendously excited to be in Beatty's flagship. I was one of his most ardent hero worshippers, and he certainly looked every inch a hero. We all quoted his famous remark to his flag captain at Jutland, when 2 of his 6 ships had blown up and his own flagship was on fire. There's something wrong with our bloody ships today, Chatfield. Turn 2 points towards the enemy. We thought the Lion was the greatest ship in the world, with the bravest men and the finest admiral. I'd just turned 16 when I joined HMS Lion as a midshipman. In some respects, conditions weren't very different from those of Nelson's days. On Sunday mornings, we used to be called at 4 a.m. We had to scrub out the mess, polish the brightwork, and get everything shipshape. One of my jobs was to look after the leather settees. On one occasion, when I failed to get one of the seams sewn up, I got beaten. That was the traditional gunroom treatment of midshipmen, or snotties as we were called. Barbaric, I suppose, but we expected it. For instance, at meals, if the sub-lieutenant of the mess stuck his fork into the beam above him, all the junior snotties had to clear out. The last one out got beaten. Or if the sub said breadcrumbs, all the junior snotties had to block their ears. If you then said quietly, "All right, Battenberg, you can listen," and you took your fingers out showing you had been listening, you got beaten. This happened the whole time. The whole thing was so bad that it had to be stopped by Admiral Beatty himself. So I was probably one of the last to go through it. Naval life in general was tough and tiring. The Lion was a coal-burning ship. It meant that whenever we came in from a sweep, we had to coal ship. It was an exhausting, dirty business, digging the coal out of the collier's hold into bags to be hoisted on board. And no one was excused from it. It took up to 10 or 12 hours. One became absolutely encrusted in coal dust. And junior snotties only had small tin bars to wash it off in at the end. All the battle cruisers were proud of their coaling efficiency. They used to take in about 250 to 300 tons an hour. But morale in the Lion was so high that on more than one occasion we took in over 400 tons an hour. It was all pretty strenuous for a youngster of 16. We were kept hard at it, keeping watch day and night, running a picket boat when in harbor, and learning our profession. We didn't get too much sleep. But hard work and discomfort didn't dim my enthusiasm for the Navy, or my love for my ship.
In 1916, the war at sea took a sinister turn. In October, German submarines, U-boats, sank 352,000 tons of Allied shipping. A rising curve on the graph spelt out danger in the clearest terms for an island power. The anti-U-boat campaign was intensified, and Admiral Jellicoe was appointed First Sea Lord to tackle the problem. His successor in command of the Grand Fleet was Admiral Beatty, flying his flag now in HMS Queen Elizabeth.
All of us in the battle cruiser fleet were delighted that Beatty was going to be the commander-in-chief. My father told me that Sir John Jellicoe was very clever and assured me that he was brave, too. But as far as I was concerned, he was an insignificant little man in old-fashioned clothes who looked like a tapir and didn't impress me at all. He would be far better, I thought, at an admiralty desk than commanding a fleet which calls for guts and leadership. When I grew older, and I trust wiser, I learned to take a very different view. In fact, I became a great admirer of Jericho. But that was how I felt at the age of 16, and others in the battle cruiser fleet shared this opinion.
In January 1917, Midshipman Battenberg joined the Grand Fleet in Beatty's new flagship, HMS Queen Elizabeth. The Grand Fleet awaited the enemy who never came, awaited also new ammunition and new equipment which Jutland had shown to be needed, and began to absorb the lessons of Jutland. In France, the Battle of the Somme had begun on July the 1st. Now it's slow to a stop amid the mud, the ice and the blizzards of a bad November. British Army casualties reached 415,000 in this battle. By the end of 1916, Britain had become a land power indeed and was learning the price of that condition. In 1917, the mood of the British people became embittered. Heavy casualties in the field brought this war home as none had ever come before. Air raids by Zeppelins and bombers destroyed the last illusion of island security. Unrestricted U-boat warfare brought rationing and privation. In 1917, conscription came in. Conscription for the army, conscription of labor, mobilization of women. And there was no sign of peace. In 1917, the British hardened their hearts and turned with increased anger against anyone at all, who seemed to be connected with the enemy.
Once more, people were in a state of hysteria, and the government felt they had to make some concession to it. In July 1917, the Prime Minister, Mr. Lloyd George, advised King George I that the royal family should take British names. The King's family took the name of Windsor. Queen Mary's family name had been Teck. That was changed to Cambridge. And my father changed our name from Battenberg to Mountbatten. And the King conferred on him the title of Marquis of Milford Haven. It was all rather ludicrous, really. I'd been born in England. I felt completely English. Having an English name didn't make me any more English, but that was the mood of the times. So now I was Midshipman Lord Louis Mountbatten. And I suppose the Mountbatten story can be said to begin at this point, July 1917, the 4th year of the Great War.